Hello, everybody. This is Miss Peachy from your WCA Biology B class, and here we are at Unit 4 still. Now we are to Lesson 15, so we're really getting close to the end, ladies and gentlemen. Our last lesson was on modest disturbances in ecosystems. We are looking now at extreme disturbances in ecosystems. Our keywords here are community, ecosystem, pioneer species, and population. All right, so as we mentioned in the previous lesson, there are some disturbances that are fairly, light to moderate in that they don't have a lasting impact on the ecosystem, right? Moderate disturbances, they can increase actually biodiversity that we learned about in the previous lesson. Um, Ecosystems are always changing. There are extreme disturbances that do happen. They're not as common, but they do impact ecosystems and they do have lasting implications on diversity and change ecosystems oftentimes. Give some examples of extreme disruptions, talks about a glacier moving through an area and then melting back. It talks a little later about a volcanic eruption. What these have in common is that glaciers, when they come through an area, they tend to not just get rid of, living things, but they actually get rid of soil in an ecosystem. So disruption of soil is kind of an important part of these extreme disturbances. They remove that whole nutrient layer of soil, right? So what you're left with is just sediment and rocks, essentially, when you're done, because they pick up all that stuff. Because there's nothing alive, we're not talking, any living things afterwards. All living things have to repopulate an area after these extreme disruptive events. Generally, the first living things that we see are lichen. Lichen are they don't have as many requirements and they can live in the absence of soil essentially. Lichen is an organism made up of two organisms that live in a mutualistic relationship. Generally, a fungus and an algae, they live together. Um, the fungus secretes these chemicals, these enzymes and acids that actually break rock down and extract nutrients from the rock. They start to create soil. That's important. The algae are photosynthetic, and so they can provide a food source for the lichen as well. The lichen houses the algae. The algae provides like these basic, fundamental nutrients to the algae that are needed, different kinds of, you know, um, ions and things like that are necessary for the algae to grow. And the algae do photosynthesis and provide food for the lichen. So it's a beautiful symbiotic relationship, mutualistic relationship. So over time, when the lichen break down the rocks, and then they die and decompose, and they start adding that organic layer to the sediment because we didn't really have soil. We really just had sediment at that point. Broken down rock is considered sediment. Remember your rock cycle, sediment forms sedimentary rock. Soil actually has organic matter in it, and that's what makes it so beneficial for plants. So without the presence of soil, you don't have plants that can grow in that area. So that's why lichen are so important. These lichen, they form they help to form the soil, and then other organisms start to move in. Some very simple plants and potentially some insects and things that can actually fertilize or pollinate the plants, right? And so those very first organisms that move in, once that soil layer has started to form, are known as pioneer species. These are things like grasses and very low-lying bushes. They don't have a lot of water requirements because the soil's not going to be super moist at this point. And eventually, other organisms can move in, as the grasses and stuff die, they add to the nutrient layer of the soil. Higher levels of nutrients in the soil can establish more complex plants. See where I'm going here? As that soil layer builds, the complexity of the plants can increase as well. These earlier um, ecosystems can't support trees yet because trees have fairly high nutrient requirements. So we're talking just low-lying stuff. And so this is what is known as succession. Our first, when we have those pioneer species, this whole process, when we start with just nothing, no soil or anything, is known as primary succession. And primary succession begins with these first successional communities that are made up with the pioneer species. And then as that nutrient layer builds in the soil, the succession continues to more complex organisms, trees, and eventually a forest can regrow where it was completely eliminated in the past or something like that. Then we see that's a much higher or later successional community. Okay, the whole process is known as succession, which I don't believe is mentioned in this lesson, but I just wanted to give you that as an aside. So it talks a bit about volcanoes and how it's a similar type of situation. Again, the bottom line is in these primary succession that we see, soil has completely eliminated. So these are extreme disturbances that completely get rid of all of that nutrient-rich soil. And so the soil has to reform in order for the ecosystem to bounce back, essentially. So that is that segment. And it talks a bit about, in this latter segment, about the oceans and how sometimes we tend to, not focus on the oceans. We don't live in the ocean. I think that's a big part of it. So we kind of focus on stuff that's right around you because you can see it and you have examples of that. But we tend to kind of overlook them, and they're huge. They make up 3/4 of the earth, right? So we definitely don't want to overlook them. In the past, people had this erroneous idea that they're so big that you can't really affect them. In fact, there was a phrase that came out, I don't even know if it was like in the 70s or whatever, and it was, so, dilution is the solution for pollution. In other words, the oceans are so big that if you dump stuff into them, it'll be so diluted that it won't matter. And so you really don't have to worry about it. And we realized that that is not true. They're big, yes, they are, but there are living things within the ocean. And so those living things can actually magnify pollution in something called biomagnification, which is a different thing we haven't talked about yet either. But that is a false assumption that you can just dilute stuff in the oceans. It says that there aren't any like major extreme events that can affect the oceans, and I actually would argue that there probably are, but those are like once every so many millions of years, things like an asteroid impact or a climate change so crazy that it would freeze up the whole earth, which happened, maybe like 600 million years ago, but not since. Um, but there are a lot of more moderate disturbances that collectively kind of become extreme. So climate change is a great example of this. As we know, climate change affects ocean sea surface temperatures all around the ocean, and that has an impact on lots of different organisms. It can cause ocean acidification, which is another kind of like branch off of climate change. It can also, we can talk about pollution in the ocean and how pollutants like nutrient pollution can cause algal blooms and things like that, which impact the ocean. Sediment pollution can cause effects on coral reefs as well. There's a lot of other things that affect the oceans. So they are not too big to fail. They are actually very, very significant. They are so significant and so important to us that we really need to make sure we're focusing on them as well because we don't want to forget something that has a huge impact on everybody on Earth. So that's everything, you guys, from lesson 15. If you have questions, let me know. Otherwise, I will see you guys in my next video.